From Their Eyes. A Shadow of the Colossus, Ico, Last Guardian, Vic. Chapter 20. The Master finally falls. Many ages had passed since the plan had been achieved. The entity that had once been Dorman and the Shadow Queen now ruled the land. During that time, the new entity they formed, known as the Master of the Valley, had spread its influence. The corruption it spread consumed and corrupted the lake and into the valley. It took the remains of the castle and transformed it into the structure that dominated the center of the valley. It took time, but the corruption spread as the entity slowly worked its way down. This was part of its plan to not only corrupt and control the land it was in, but to reach the former prison known as the Forbidden Lands. The entity had already concluded that breaching that barrier would immediately merge the lands, causing massive devastation outside the valley. It was more than those had deserved for not listening to Dorman. For the time being, the Master of the Valley used its power to gain control over the last of the colossi in the land. During all that time, the colossi had died out, leaving only the domesticated flying ones. The Master used that to its advantage, using its power to enslave those flying colossi. They would become the flying army of the Master. The shadow beings also benefited from all of this. With the power of the Master, the shadow beings now inhabited suits of armor that the Master had created. All these knights would patrol the nest, as the Master now dubbed its home, and bring those gifted in magical energy. The knights would capture them and feed the really rich ones to the Master. This combination just made the Master more powerful, and with its army of flying feathered colossi and knights, it brought the living population in this world down to near extinction levels. That would not be a problem, not with the time almost at hand. In fact, by the Master's calculations, the breakthrough would make it unstoppable and immortal beyond all measures. Nothing could ever defeat it again. The flying colossi would fly to all the villages outside the valley and claim children to feed the Master. The colossi, which those outside the valley called tricos, were all good at bringing children rich in magic and life force. In fact, the Master was certain that it would be soon that the breakthrough would happen and that the people would die, if not right away, but shortly afterwards. Already the sky was destabilizing as lightning was flashing around the valley. It could sense that some of the tricos were bringing in children. At one point, one bolt of lightning struck one of them, and the creature fell to the flat floor of the valley. The Master was already instructing its knights to secure the fallen and deal with them as needed. It could sense the child that Trico was carrying was very powerful. What happened in the following hours was very distressing to the Master of the Valley. It started that the child, a boy, had managed to recover and even helped the Trico recover from the lightning strike. This had led to the Master losing connection with the Trico. The Master didn't doubt that this was because that particular Trico was young. If that bond was allowed to flourish, it could lead to disaster. Time progressed, and the bond did continue. In fact, the bonded Trico was fighting the others and fighting the knights. The master passed on the information to use the insignia on the rogue Trico to bring it back under control. It had used that symbol to instill fear in them and keep them under control. But the child was helping it as well. The child kept breaking all the symbols used to stop the rogue Trico. It was even worse that the boy learned about the secret abilities of the Trico and how to use them. The Master of the Valley sent more and more knights to stop the boy and the rogue Trico. The Master increased the numbers the closer the child and the rogue Trico got to the center of the nest. At least the Master was certain that the Trico could not get into its inner sanctum. Should the child be able to convince the Trico to attack it, the Master of the Valley might be destroyed, so close to its victory. The Master did have a cage around itself for protection, and it had its shadow power ebbing out from its core. Any child delivered to it was absorbed into the power, at least while they remained unconscious. The power could knock a child out, but it took time and prolonged contact. The shadow power would reach out for the children when one was near. The Master of the Valley eventually felt their shadow power surge in a direction, and it saw the child arrive. It was the child. It saw the child back away. But the Master's shadow power still tried to surge toward to the boy. Then the beam of light hit it, causing the shadow power to recede inward. It exposed the cage, and the Master had to protect itself. Eventually the light stopped, and when the Master of the Valley could sense again, it noticed the child climbing up the cage, and then up to the top of the tower. The Master had no doubt what the child was going to do. The child was going to get the rogue Trico to the top of the tower to attack them. The Master summoned all the loyal Trico to stop them. In what seemed like moments, there was a terrible fight happening on the top of the tower. No doubt the loyal Tricos were making sure the rogue Trico would be powerless, and they would kill it. Then this lone child would be sent to feed the Master of the Valley. The Master's thoughts were cut short when something fell down into its sanctum. It was the tail of the rogue Trico, and to the Master's horror, it glowed with power. How could it still have power if it was no longer attached to the beast? Didn't have time to ponder that question as the child returned to the sanctum, and the bright light was brought back. It was then that the unthinkable happened to the Master of the Valley. First, the cage protecting it was destroyed. The shattering of the cage meant a lack of protection. After that, another blast happened, and the power from that shattered the physical form of the Master of the Valley. For the first time in its long existence, it felt true death. The Master of the Valley's thought processes ceased, and thus everything else it constructed started to collapse. In the end, it felt a brief moment of rage, knowing it was so close to achieving the ultimate power and everlasting life. It was cheated the godhood it had spent countless ages working to achieve. Trico managed to recover enough from the attacks as the others collapsed and fell to their deaths. He had been freed for a reason. He had to free his kind and others from that feeling of evil that had controlled him for so long. He was awakened to that when the lightning struck him. He made his way over to the child, who had managed to make his way out of the inner sanctum of the Master of the Valley. The child had been greatly hurt, and no doubt, without the others of his kind to help him, he would die. Trico knew what he had to do to save the child. Trico quickly consumed the child and held the injured child in his throat. He then took off and flew off back to the village that he had gotten the child from. He knew why they took the children at night, and it would be a risk to his own life to return in the daylight. But he had to. He had to right this last wrong. During his flight there, he felt his kind's history open to him. It happened as the valley collapsed. His kind had chosen domestication because the colossi were dying out. Their war with the shadow beings had taken a toll on all of them. The second war doomed them to a slow extinction, and they chose to leave the little people alone. His kind had hoped to serve the little people until they learned to harness magic in their own way. Sadly, when the castle that housed the shadow beings collapsed, it had led to the creation of the valley, and the master of the valley took over. Trico was the last of all the colossi beings, and even his life was nearing its end. The enslaved ones had done enough damage that he had no hope of recovery. It was for the best, as the time of the colossi had to end now. That was why he didn't pay any heed to the spears that were being thrown at him, and even those that connected with him. When he landed, he was surrounded by the little people, but that didn't stop him from spitting up the child and depositing him on the ground for them. He wasn't going to leave until he was sure the child was all right. He watched as someone picked up the child and carried him away. The ones with the spears still pointed them, and even tried to strike him with the spears. But he didn't care. He wanted to be sure the child was alive. When Trico heard the child say something, he knew he had completed his last task. He flapped his wings, which scared the little people and resulted in more spears. But he took off and flew away from the village. He was the last of his kind, and he was not long for the world. He was going to fly back to the valley, where he could at least end his time in the world where the rest of his kind had perished. The end. I want to thank all of you who have listened to every part of this. And if you haven't listened to every part of this, I do urge you to go and listen to every part of it. This project was a labor of love that took over a decade to get done, as I worked between different projects and my home life. I invite you all to check it out. I invite you all to check the series of games out. Now that I've finished this project, I hope to give these games a try one day. Most likely through emulation. But if you have enjoyed these videos, please check out the stories and the links that are in all the descriptions of these videos. This labor of love is a unique point of view for the whole series, as during the whole time that I wrote this and even recorded all these videos, I have never once played the games. Like I said, maybe I'll get a chance to try them now. And please check out the other stuff that I have up on the YouTube channel. I do greatly appreciate it. For now, I wish you all the best. Take care. Have fun. Like and subscribe.